As we wrap up our series on the book State of Exception by Giorgio Agamben, we'll have a look, especially in this video, at how Agamben deals with the figure of Walter Benjamin, the Jewish writer from the 20th century. And I would suggest that in chapters 4 and 6 especially, Agamben uses Benjamin as a kind of solution to the problem of the state of exception. That doesn't mean that he agrees with all of Benjamin's ideas, but I do think that he takes Benjamin's idea of divine violence and sees it in some ways as a kind of template that provides a kind of utopian solution. So we'll try to trace this in the video and try to help you make some sense of Agamben's ideas towards the end of the book. Now, Benjamin writes very famously in his essay Critique of Violence, all violence as a means is either law-making or law-preserving. And what he's talking about there especially is that within a state, right, within a nation, you might say, the state likes to have a monopoly over violence. So we might kind of sketch this out a little bit here. So we have the state, okay, the state. And the state would like to make sure that it has control over any kind of violence that is both lawmaking, okay, lawmaking and law preserving. There we go. And both of these, we might say, are means to an end. Okay, so these things are the means to an end. And this idea of thinking about means and ends is really central to Benjamin's critique of violence. All right, so by looking at this then, basically the state wants to control violence, and we can see this even in the way the police operates, according to Benjamin. If we think, for instance, of the police using kind of emergency measures, okay, so emergency measures, sometimes abusing the law, so emergency measures, sometimes there's abuse, there's a lot of interpretation of how the law should be applied, and what we see then in the way the police operates is that sometimes it's simply law preserving, right, just keeping the order and the peace, but sometimes it's also interpreting the law and law making in a sense. So it's doing both of those things. And the police then is a good example of how the state tries to keep a monopoly over violence. Another way we can think about this is that one thing that the state really hates is when the laborers go on strike. Okay, so how does the state relate to strikes? Well, if people go on a strike, then there's a lot of debate about whether that strike is violent or not. Even a non-violent strike, you know, the laborers are just in the streets and they're marching, but they're not destroying any property or anything like that. For Benjamin, the state still sees this as violent because there's an element of extortion involved. Okay, so there's an element of extortion because the strike leaders are always making demands, right? They're saying, we're striking because we want this. We want more pay or longer vacations or who knows what. So if that's the case, then what these strikers are really doing is they're still using a kind of violence, extortion, as a means to an end. And for Benjamin then, those kinds of strikes don't really solve the problem because you're still using the same logic as what the state uses. You're using violence as a means to an end. Okay, so if you're still stuck within that same kind of logic, then you're not really going to resolve the problem. The only way to kind of resolve the problem is to see that there might be a kind of violence outside of the law. And this is what Walter Benjamin refers to as divine violence. Divine violence. He gives the example of divine violence from the Old Testament, for instance, where the sons of Korah are swallowed up by the earth. Other terms for this are pure violence and also sovereign violence. Now, this kind of violence, you could say, is a kind of pure means, okay, a pure means without an end. And to really understand this, think about, for instance, the notion of anger. Let's say that you suddenly get upset with somebody. I mean, this happens to all of us, and you just have a burst of anger. Okay, so let's think of another example here. A burst of anger. Well, that anger is not really planned so much, and it's not really towards an end. You're not trying to achieve anything by it. You're just really angry and you need to kind of burst out, right? So we can say it's a manifestation and it's spontaneous. Well, that seems to escape the logic then of having a means to an end. And now we have a pure means, okay? It's simply a means with no end that's associated with it. There's no goal associated with it. If we were to extrapolate from this a little bit further, we might think then of other things that could fit this same description. And these things could be, for instance, a proletarian general strike. Okay, proletarian general strike, which basically means all the workers are out in the street, but they're not really demanding specific things. They're just really angry, kind of like a burst of anger, which might lead them to want to abolish the state altogether, right? To do away with it altogether. Although you could argue that in that case, they still have an end in sight. And this is one of the problems that Benjamin faces, I think, is that it's very difficult to get out of the means to an end logic. And so ends, there almost always seem to be ends anyways, but that's a different discussion. Another thing we could mention here is revolutionary violence. Revolutionary violence, which seems to fit the same logic, right? So if you are starting a revolution, but you don't really have a clear sense of what you want the next government to be, but you're simply angry, you want to destroy things, well, perhaps that could be a kind of divine violence. What we see then is two very different ways to think about violence. On the one hand, the state likes to control everything, and on the other hand, we have potentially this divine violence outside of the law. Now, the reason why Carl Schmitt needs to react to this in a sense is because these concepts of lawmaking and law-preserving violence are actually surprisingly close to a couple of concepts that Carl Schmitt himself uses. So lawmaking, if you recall, is very similar to constituent power. Constituent power. All right. And law preserving is very similar to constituted power. Constituted power. And that is why Carl Schmitt, in his 1922 book, Political Theology, according to Agamben, tries to react to this by focusing less perhaps on constituent and constituted power and more on this notion of the decision. Okay, so if we think then about what he does, is he tries to basically put the exception, the state of exception, within the law and tie it to the sovereign's decision. The sovereign's decision. Okay. Basically, he's taking this notion of divine violence and trying to pull it back into the law by saying, you know what? When there is this kind of sovereign decision, which seems random and outside the law, we can bring it back in, because the sovereign, after all, is both inside and outside the law, and the sovereign, through the decision, can control this state of exception. So that might have seemed like a pretty good response, but Walter Benjamin also responded to Carl Schmitt again, and for him, if you take these two ideas, so you have the law on one hand, right? You have the law, and then you have what's outside of the law, which we might call enemy, as we've seen before, and you make them synonymous, because that's what happens when the sovereign pulls the state of exception into the law for Walter Benjamin, then basically the state of exception becomes the rule. Okay, so the state of exception, there we go, the state of exception is the rule now. The tendency here, in other words, is that the law is this kind of corrupting force, and as soon as it tries to capture what is outside of it, it becomes contaminated by it, and eventually we cannot distinguish between the two. Whereas if we think about what Carl Schmitt is trying to do, he's basically saying, well, we have the law, okay, we have the law, and then we have the sovereign who's both inside and outside of it, okay, and then this tandem, you might say, these two together, they try to capture the pure violence of the state of exception. So they try to capture what's outside of it. They try to capture divine violence. And if they can capture that, they will include it within this state of exception, which is inside of the law. All right, so a little bit repetitive here on my part, but I'm trying to kind of sketch out this dialogue and to show you what's happening. We might argue then that eventually these two positions can seem quite close to each other. So maybe one way to think about it is that on the one hand, if we think of Carl Schmitt's model, we have kind of two circles here again, right? We have the law and we have animi, or the life. And basically, the law tries to conquer life and animi through this concept of force of law, which we talked about before, force of law, which was crossed out if you recall. And the state of exception allows the law to conquer in this direction. Okay, so this is an image of conquest, we might say, or annexation. Now, if we think then about the other model, it's actually somewhat similar in a way. All right, but now we can think of this as revolutionary violence, through which the life that is here, the animi, kind of destroys, you might say, destroys the state. Okay, so we have more destruction. Destroys. There we go. And what we have here instead is a kind of pure means. There we go. So we have pure means on this side, and we have some kind of state of exception on this end. But they actually seem remarkably similar sometimes. And so, as Agamben suggests, sometimes it feels like you're moving the same pawn across the chessboard. That's the image that he uses there. Well, how do we solve this problem, right? How do we solve this problem? And it seems that for both Agamben and for Walter Benjamin, the only solution is, in a sense, to get out, right? Now you're living in the state of exception, which has been conflated with the rule, and you need to get out somehow. Well, how do you do this? How do you escape this whole complex entanglement altogether? And that's kind of the question at the end of the book, you might say. The solution, in a sense, is very similar to what Benjamin argues for, which is that we need a kind of pure means. Okay, so we need a pure means without an end. We're not trying to achieve a specific end. And if we do that, we will get to life, right? Kind of a restored life, although there's no beginning before the law, as Agamben argues. And we will also get to justice, or at least the beginning of justice, which is a different concept than law here. But the only way to do that is not to have the law anymore, in a sense. We're basically discarding the law. Or a good example that Agamben uses towards the end of his work is he gives this example of studying an old law. Okay, studying an old law without any attempt to apply it. You're not trying to make it normative. You're not trying to put it in force. You are simply playing with the law, right? It doesn't actually apply. You're just studying it for its own sake, and it's pure means, but there's no end to it. It seems that Agamben himself sometimes does that because he's very interested in old laws, but it might be objected that there's some irony to this because he himself is studying old laws with the goal, the end, of changing social views and specific laws. So his own book might actually make this kind of approach somewhat ironic. But basically, he wants to get to a place where the law, okay, the law does not bind. Law does not bind. And in that sense, he's similar to Walter Benjamin, who also suggested that we need to get beyond this problem where the state wants to use violence as a means to an end, as you recall here, right? This box here kind of shows how the state creates a monopoly over violence. As an aside, I think this also really sheds some light on, for instance, in the United States, where there's an attempt to defund the police. And there, too, you can see that for some of these protesters, the police are inherently violent, that violence is associated with the state. It is a means to an end, and there's no way for a protester like that to see violence as good, perhaps. It has a very negative kind of connotation, and as a result, the only way is to kind of get outside the box, which would mean defunding the police. So the theory here, I think, really helps to explain some of these social movements even today. Which is not, this is my own application, but maybe you can see a connection with Agamben here. So we come to the end then, and I think you would probably agree that this is a bit of a utopian solution, because how do you get to pure means, right? And you might argue that this contrast between means and ends, okay, means and ends, is itself a binary opposition. So if it is a binary opposition, shouldn't we be blurring the boundaries? Shouldn't we even be applying the state of exception to it to kind of complicate this relationship? Is it really possible to go to pure means, or is that more of a dream? I think those are some fascinating questions to consider as we wrap up this series.